Thanks so much for tuning in. We are continuing with our policy coverage, talking to experts. And in that line, we have Saugata Bhattacharya. He needs no introduction, really joins us right now on the show. With me is my colleague Pallavi Nahata as well. Saugata, great having you. Thanks for joining in. What is your
Thank you.
initial
Thank you, Neeraj.
assessment of what the governor did, or what the MPC did and what they said?
That's right. No, thank you again for having me on your show. Unexpected, the actions were on expected lines. The statement, the tone, the language was definitely more hawkish than expected. So this is despite the increasing dissent within the MPC. So as your viewers already know, I mean, there was one MPC member who dissented on the rate increase. The implicit suggestion is that he opposed any rate hike, and two of the MPC members had different views on the retention of the stance. But despite the dissent, the majority statement is definitely more hawkish than we had expected. You remember that they have inserted that additional statement, break the back of core inflation. So core inflation is actually now part of the statement. So I mean, it has already been. I mean, the governor's statement, etc., mentioned core inflation, but now this is an explicit objective amongst the others. I mean, to with the second order effects and anchoring inflation expectations, so we break the back of core inflation. So this is definitely more hawkish than we had expected. They have ratcheted up that statement despite the dissent. But other than that, and the second part of this, in addition to the rate increases, the stance of liquidity. That market participants need to be weaned off the excess liquidity, an additional measure which indicates a hawkish stance. So obviously the intent is to keep short-term money market rates above the repo, probably closer to the MSF rate, which increases the overall cost of funds of the banking system and other participants as well.
Right. Pallavi?
So you've touched upon liquidity. Considering normalizing liquidity, I'm just wondering, what is the reason possibly behind the reluctance by the MPC to change stance, and can we expect more active liquidity management in the coming needs?
Great questions. I mean, so obviously, in terms of retention of the stance, focus on withdrawal of accommodation. This is relative to the conditions that governor's statement had explicitly laid out in the last policy statement. This is relative to conditions prevailing in 2019, in May and June 2019, where the policy rate was then at 5.7 and 6%. Respectively, and inflation at that point in time was close to 3%, and liquidity was in system deficit. So compared to that situation, the current inflation level at 6.7 to 6.5% plus, expected to remain 6.5% plus for the next 3 or 4 months, and a system liquidity in surplus of 1.45 lakh crores in the average surplus in November. The stance that the MPC considers is definitely more accommodative than what it was in 2019. So in respect to that, is we need to interpret what the forthcoming actions might be in terms of the monetary policy statement. So that's one. And part of your second query on what the intent and reasoning might be for keeping liquidity tight. My own guess is an element of currency management, foreign exchange management is part. Because remember, a part of that, rather than just the pure interest rate defense of the currency, is also maintaining liquidity at levels which discourage speculative buildup of liquidity positions. You remember the old 2013 MSF action, which severely crimped liquidity. So excess liquidity, which can be used potentially for speculative positioning in the currency markets, also needs to be discouraged. Given that, my own sense is that once, as Governor mentioned, there's a durable turn in the liquidity cycle. In other words, the average liquidity for the month, which is now getting moved by government balances with the RBI. So during the tax collection periods, liquidity gets into a deficit, and then once government begins to spend, liquidity turns surplus. So once this cycle begins to move towards zero or a negative structural liquidity system, just like in 2019, at that point in time, more durable measures other than the VRR sort of measures for injecting temporary liquidity, more durable measures like OMO bond purchases, like maybe even a CRR cut at that point in time begins to look then might begin to be considered. But at this point in time, keeping in being inconsistent with a removal of accommodative stance, I don't think they will encourage a durable injection of liquidity at this point in time.
All right. So you did touch upon this from the last MPC minutes and from today's resolution as well. There's clear and rising divergence between the external and the RBI MPC members, if we may put it that way. How much is that likely to weigh on the next MPC meet?
Well, I mean, obviously, these things are being discussed within the MPC. I mean, different points of view, and which is good. I mean, I mean, dissent is actually good. The more assumptions are stressed, that what the validity of the forecasts are, what are individual thoughts on the potential. I mean, because remember, at this point in time, when we presumably are approaching the terminal rate, whatever that might be. I mean, 6.25, 6.5, 6.75, whatever that terminal rate is. These dissents and more intense discussions are probably needed, because remember, I'm not being jocular about this. So although we are targeting a glide path down to a 4%, we need to be MPC needs to be mindful that growth also doesn't get dragged down to another 4%. Yeah, so I mean, so the trade-offs in the inflation growth dynamics needs to be understood very carefully, because there are multiple other factors. Like, my worry is always, I mean, growth conditions, aggregate demand right now looks to be very, very strong and resilient, as Governor also mentioned in his statement, as MPC's statement mentioned. My worry is, given the pace of the tightening, remember the transmission this time has been very strong. Yeah, with a lot of the loans now linked to the repo rate, the EBR, external benchmark rate, has been very strong. The entire rate hike has been passed through. Despite this, growth and demand remains strong. We are already seeing the first signs of some slowdown in certain segments. As I mean, the backward-looking Q2 results. I mean, whatever some parts of the high-frequency indicators now. My worry is that we should not approach a tipping point in non-linear response of demand where there is a sudden fall of the cliff for aggregate demand. It is difficult now to see that, to foresee that situation, that contingency coming. But who knows? I mean, in an environment where 2023 global growth is expected to slow to 2%, for the developed markets to slow to zero or a mild recession, who knows how the spillovers might begin to affect India. So that is what probably needs to be kept in mind. However, I don't think at this point in time, MPC is still done with rate increases, probably more moderate increases. So let's see how the demand conditions in the next couple of months plays out.
All right. So one last question from my side. So you've touched upon the growth dynamics at this stage. Inflation, the governor and the MPC have emphasized on sticky and high core inflation. Food, they said, is expected to come down. How does it work here on? What about services? And where do you see core inflation from here on?
So our average inflation forecast for the next year is about 5.1, 5 to 5.1, with core also at 5 to 5.1. So, I mean, we do expect, and given the conditions now that, globally supply chains are normalizing, the container rates for the busy traffic corridors, shipping corridors have come off 80-90% in the last 6 months. Commodities prices, presumably, fingers crossed that with the global recession and China not picking up very, very significantly, still moderately, improving moderately, hopefully commodities prices will still remain more or less contained. If those external stimuli into domestic core inflation come in, if the ability of corporates to pass on input costs, the falling input costs onto the end consumers still remains moderate, as we saw in some segments in Q2. then hopefully core inflation will fall pretty rapidly from the current 5.96% levels down to about 5%. That should be good enough. I think if that actually the eventuality happens, then they will probably be able to moderate their rate hikes without having a significant impact on aggregate demand and growth.
Neeraj?
Yep, no, we are out of time, but Saugata, thanks so much for joining in today and giving us your thoughts. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you
The
so
pleasure
much,
was
Neeraj and
ours.
Pandami. Thank you.
The pleasure
Thank
was
you.
ours, and viewers, thanks for tuning in.